Now let's talk about America's friends across the pond. I'm talking about Europe, specifically France. It has a problem with NATO's plans for the Indo-Pacific. The military alliance wants to open an office in Japan. It will be NATO's first outpost in the region. President Emmanuel Macron has a problem with that. He thinks NATO shouldn't go ahead. I have Macron's statement. Listen to what he said. If we push NATO to enlarge the spectrum and the geography, we will make a big mistake. He calls the move to expand a mistake. But why? Macron thinks by expanding NATO will lose its focus. Now this is a problem. If NATO wants an office in Japan, it just cannot go ahead and build one. An expansion like that needs to be put through a vote. The proposal will go to the North Atlantic Council, the highest decision-making body of NATO. All NATO members are represented there. They'll vote on this proposal and their verdict needs to be unanimous. Only then will NATO be able to open an office in Japan. So France will be a stumbling block. Is this proposal unprecedented? Not at all. NATO has a dozen more liaison offices or delegations. They're spread out across the world. There's one in Ukraine too, a country in the middle of a conflict. Most of these offices are small. They help in maintaining ties with the host country's military and government. NATO hasn't formally announced this, but reports say NATO wants something similar in Japan, a small office, one that can help the military alliance stay in touch with Tokyo. The idea is not a new one. NATO and Japan have been considering this since 2007. Now in 2018, Tokyo opened an office in Brussels. Brussels hosts the NATO headquarters. The war in Ukraine has led to deeper ties. Last year, Fumio Kishida was invited for the NATO summit. This year's summit is scheduled for July. Lithuania is hosting the event and the Japanese Prime Minister is invited again. Now earlier this year, the NATO chief was in Tokyo. He had hailed Japan's decision to spend more on its military.
I also told him that I strongly welcome Japan's historic new national security strategy. And I'm glad that Japan is planning to reach the NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP devoted to defense. This demonstrates that Japan takes international security seriously. It makes you an even more powerful partner for peace.
So both sides like each other. Then why is Macron opposed? Maybe because he doesn't want to anger China. Macron is trying to court Beijing. Earlier this year, he travelled to China. It was a high-profile visit. Beijing left no stone unturned for this. It went all out to make Macron feel welcomed. The French president, too, did not disappoint the Chinese. He made all the right noises. In China, Macron spoke out about the Taiwan issue and the larger fight between the US and China. The French president said that Europe should stay away from this conflict. He also thinks the region should not snap economic ties with Beijing. Listen in.
We must not be naive. Our European Union, taking this step of European sovereignty that I defended 5 years ago, is establishing trade defense instruments that are necessary for our credibility. But the European Union must also be voluntarily committed to continuing to have a trade relationship with China.
Well, that sounded a lot like appeasement. US and its allies too saw it that way. They were not happy with Macron's outreach. But the criticism has not affected Macron much. It seems he's still on the same path. That's why perhaps he's pushing NATO to stay away from the Indo-Pacific. But other NATO members have different thoughts. They're deepening their ties with the region. Consider what's happening in New Delhi this week. Defense ministers of leading NATO nations are visiting India. Yesterday, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was here. He spoke out about NATO's plans for the region.
We are absolutely not trying to establish a NATO in the Indo-Pacific. We continue to work with like-minded countries to ensure that the region remains free and open.
Today, the German defense minister was in New Delhi. There's talk of a submarine deal. Reports say Germany wants to build submarines in India. So one way or another, NATO members are taking more interest in the region. Obviously, regional players like India will set the terms of engagement, but more cooperation is inevitable, whether Macron likes it or not.